This is going to be a little bit of a different kind of panel on affordable housing. And so I want to start off with a few remarks and some historical notes to kind of give us the setting here. So let me change to that. And you know, we look at, housing is not affordable in Los Angeles, it's not affordable in California, and we need to do something about that. And I think it's useful to look back at history. And so there was a time back in the 1960s and before, and it started, started off with a number of urban planning architects, and a Swiss-French architect by the name of Le Corbusier was one of the leading advocates of city planning, which had these tall, gleaming steel and glass apartment buildings to house populations densely, all connected by ribbons of concrete. And that's how we got, or that was one of the driving forces behind the freeways in American cities. And so I'm showing you this. This is from the Los Angeles Times, I think it was 1965. It says, plans drawn for offshore Santa Monica Island chain. And you can't see it too well here, but on the right-hand side is actually the map. And the plan was to build a series of islands off of Santa Monica and Pacific Palisades, and to connect the I-10 going through those islands to the Topanga Freeway, which you've never heard of, that was going to go through Topanga Canyon like the 405 goes through Sepulveda Canyon, and up through the San Fernando Valley. There was also a Beverly Hills Freeway, what happened was, and it's kind of epitomized by the battle over Greenwich Village in New York between a group led by Jane Jacobs, who later wrote a book called The Death and Life of American Cities, and Robert Moses, who was the architect of building out New York skyscrapers. It kind of centered around a freeway interchange that was going to go through Washington Square in the middle of Greenwich Village. And the argument on the part of Jane Jacobs and her group, which was used again and again throughout the country and certainly here in California, was that communities mattered and that freeways broke up communities. And that argument resonated and won, and that is why the 710 freeway is never going to be connected to the 210, and why you're not going to see these islands out in Santa Monica Bay or the Topanga Freeway. And what that gave us in many places, and certainly here in Southern California, was restrictive zoning and restrictions on housing. And the idea was to maintain communities and to keep them together and to keep that kind of vibrancy that Glaser talks about in his Triumph of the City. Keep that vibrancy in the cities. But as you've heard our speakers earlier, William was showing you, and Stuart and David, what that means is restricted housing. And when the supply is restricted over time, now it's been 40 years, what you have is high-priced housing, which is now not affordable for those people for whom the communities were supposed to be protected from. And that's why we are in the situation that we are today with unaffordable housing. That's kind of a bit of the history. But the reason for having this panel and this discussion today is we're kind of at a crossroads here in Los Angeles and in America in general in thinking about housing and what we want our cities to look like. The city of Los Angeles, post Measure S, is now reconsidering, what does the city plan look like? And it's a perfect time to go back and think about this in terms of communities and infrastructure and what affordable housing is all about. So we have a great panel today, and I want to let each one of them speak a bit about what they're doing, and then we'll have a discussion and then some time for questions. So let's begin with our first panelist, Ben Winter, who is in charge of housing policy for the city of Los Angeles. He's in the mayor's office. He studied at the University of Wisconsin and at NYU, And so Ben, why don't you tell us, I'm not going to do much on biographies because I want to hear from them. So why don't you tell us about the city or the mayor's vision or your vision?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting this important conversation. You know, I work to help realize the mayor's goals to really expand the supply of housing and grow the housing stock in an equitable way and in a very sustainable way. So when I say sustainable way, kind of mean figuring out how to grow the supply of housing along our burgeoning transit infrastructure and equitably in a way to help prevent displacement in hot market areas and to make sure that we as a city are growing the stock of housing for a range of Angelenos, not just luxury market rate housing. So at a very basic level, we're growing the supply of housing through a variety of development reform initiatives. We kind of have two camps of those. One we call the Back to Basics development reform initiatives, things that we can do administratively, like parallel design permitting process to help get medium and larger apartments started on construction while more detailed plans are getting developed. But also larger development reform initiatives as we update our 35 community plans, which were originally on a 30-year timeline to update, and we've kind of put a lot of resources to shrink that down to a 6-year timeline. So, there's a lot of work to do in this camp, but we've made significant progress in the last few years on housing production overall. Currently, this fiscal year, we're on track to permit more housing than we have since the 1980s. And we're already surpassing the mayor's goal towards getting to permitting 100,000 units by 2021. But, honestly, a simple supply side market rate approach is very important, but alone will not solve the crisis. So we're trying to advance a number of initiatives to help nudge the private sector to produce affordable housing on site and to double our production and preservation of affordable housing. We have a lot of different initiatives in this camp. The one that I'm really excited about should go into effect later this summer, July, August. It's called a Transit-Oriented Communities Program that voters passed and with Measure JJJ. It essentially expands dramatically zoning incentives for developers to produce more affordable housing on site. So you can get up to an 80% density bonus if you're near a major transit station, FAR, Florida Area Ratio incentives, a lot of extra parking reductions along transit in exchange for affordable housing. We're also going to be rolling out something called the Permanent Supportive Housing Ordinance that will remove a lot of regulatory barriers for permanent supportive housing developments. It would drastically reduce density requirements and parking requirements for permanent supportive housing no matter where you are across the city. And that we're kind of doing that in tangent with revising our density bonus program. So we've got these initiatives to help encourage, incentivize developers to produce affordable housing on site. And in tangent, a new policy that's at the City Council right now for their deliberation is a proposal that would require developers to produce affordable housing on site, take advantage of our incentive programs. But if you don't take advantage of the incentive programs and produce affordable housing on site, then we'd expect a modest fee to be paid to the city called an affordable housing linkage fee that the development community, like a sales organization, could use to produce affordable housing for them. So this is an important policy. I'm sure we'll maybe touch on it a little bit here, but it's incredibly important because in the last decade or so, we've seen the financing and resources for affordable housing be diminished over time, including during the Obama years for sequestration. Our block grants for affordable housing production have been cut in half. The president's latest budget proposal completely eliminates the federal block grants that we use to produce affordable housing. So we need to kind of create new revenue streams for that work. This would also give us a little bit more flexibility in how we finance affordable housing. It has a lot less restrictions than the federal block grants. We can develop new loan products to help preserve existing affordable housing, to help create affordable housing out of the existing smaller multifamily stock, things like that. So that just kind of gives you a broad overview of what we're doing to grow the stock of housing, but really nudge the private sector to help us pitch in, actually build a range of affordable housing on site.
Great, thank you. So let me turn to Tom. Tom Safran, to my left, has made a long career in developing housing and studied at Trinity College, is an Anderson MBA graduate, and has been building affordable and senior units and mixed-use units all over LA. So let me not talk about what you're doing, but ask you to talk about it.
Thank you. And in fact, I just came back from Trinity. It was my 50th reunion this past weekend, so very special. My career, I worked at HUD from '69 in Chicago and came out here for a wedding and loved it. And in fact, Andrew Gross is here to help maybe. He's president of our development company, and his uncle Andy got married here in 1969, and I sat next to his mother before they knew each other. So Andrew and I and our team have been developing projects since '74. I left HUD then, and in LA, and I first want to compliment you in the city of LA. I don't think you realize how far the city has come, because when I started, there wasn't any ordinance to allow reduction in parking for senior housing. That took a big effort. There wasn't any increase in density for affordable housing or reduction for family. There wasn't any local funds for this program, and the city basically fought projects in most parts of the community. Stuart Gabriel earlier talked about how you do affordable housing and do it on the west side. You do it by somebody as crazy as we were about 10 years ago, buying land in the west side, west of the 405, and doing an affordable project that the neighborhood council embraced. And when we got to the planning commission, a few neighbors opposed it, and we got to the city council, we reduced the density from 178 to 155, and then we got a lawsuit. So one of the things you have to address here is the California Environmental Quality Act interferes with all of our good intentions and is used by neighbors to stop projects. The amount of funding is the key ingredient. There have been many times when we've done affordable housing and attempted to do a project that we are waiting a long period. We waited about 3 years to get funding for this project after we got the land use approvals and settled with the neighbors over the density. So funding is key, and what's happened in the city with HHH and in the county with H, there were 2 referendums on the ballot that added funds to this program. All it's gonna do in truth is maybe make up some of the deficit on the federal level. What's happened is we've gone from a federal government in 1968 when Otto Kerner, the former governor of Illinois, chaired a commission called the Kerner Commission report. Lyndon Johnson was the president. It's hard to believe that's 49 years ago because I remember it vividly. And they said all American families are entitled to a decent, safe, and sanitary home. But that's not where we're at today. And that belief system doesn't exist in Washington. It's a minority vision, certainly by the Democratic Party and minimal Republicans. There was so much funding. In my career, I worked in the HUD office in LA, and we had thousands of units, like 25,000 units we were doing a year, as I recall, in the early 70s of 236 affordable housing. Now, how many does the city do a year? Do you fund 1,000?
A little less than 1,000.
A little less than 1,000 in the city of LA. The dramatic drop on the federal level has been so great. So it needs this commitment. I congratulate all of you who are behind these two referendums, H and Triple H, and any other support, because what do you need to create affordable housing? You need money. You need land use that helps. James Frost is here. He's a developer. He uses SB 1818. That's a state law that allows, he does luxury market rate apartments, but he gets an increased density and he gets some breaks from the city when you do affordable housing. So all that combination is what's required to deal with this problem. And one last note to understand the dynamics. We just did in Playa Vista, the former council member, Bill Rosendahl, required for phase 2 of Playa Vista affordable housing. We fortunately were selected to do the 86 unit project. We got the land for free, or $1. It was free. Free? $1 we paid. Okay, it was $1. And we then applied to the state and fortunately got 9% credit. And by getting 9% credit, we were able to build this project. And our rents ended up about $500 to $1,000, about $500 to $1,000. Next door, the rents are $3,000. Don Bren building his mammoth project down in Playa Vista. So $3,000, $500 to $1,000. The last point I want to say, what are we doing about the middle class? There is nothing for that in between. When CRA used to exist, our community redevelopment agency in LA, they were interested in middle income housing. Projects were built that did low and then lower middle and middle. We've got to address all these issues, and good luck to you all. To us all.
So, thank you, and that was a perfect segue to Isela Gracian. Isela is president of the East LA Community Corporation. She did her studies at the University of California at Davis, and prior to being president, she was vice president of operations. And just one other note before I turn the mic over to Isela, and that is that she was appointed a Women's Policy Institute Fellow, which is a great honor for your work in the communities of East LA. And so we were talking about these communities, and Tom was just talking about it's not just affordable housing for the low end, it's kind of the whole spectrum. So maybe you can share what's happening in your part of the city and with community and affordable housing and gentrification and so on.
Well, thank you and good morning, everybody. When you mentioned the Women's Policy Institute, that was back in 06, 07. In the Women's Policy Institute, we were part of that program was being able to work state bills. And our team was trying to get the legislature to look at the impeding foreclosure crisis. And I remember being we would go to these meetings and everybody's like, you know what, that sounds great, but you should go talk to somebody else. And nobody wanted to pick up on the issue because the crisis wasn't there yet, right? So then comes a year later and all the legislators were scrambling around like, what could we do around like the foreclosure crisis? And as the state was doing that, in Bull Heights and at ELAC, we were doing a foreclosure prevention program where we were working with those individuals that were getting hit the hardest by losing their homes. And I remember there was a time where we went on Univision, and then we dubbed it the Univision effect, because there was thousands of calls that would come into our office where it shut down our phone system because of the need around the foreclosure crisis. And when it comes to the affordable rental housing, we focus in Bull Heights, unincorporated East LA, and we build at neighborhood scale. So our largest project to date is 50 units. And our most recent one that we opened in Bull Heights has 50 units, and we had nearly 2,000 applicants for those 50 units. And just to give you an idea that reflects some of the numbers that were shared earlier at the national level, and that crunch for housing, particularly affordability, low income, extremely low income families. And we see that every day, right? And our organization started 22 years ago with our founders looking at their neighborhood in Bowl Heights and East LA and seeing that there were other development corporations that were gaining a lot of notoriety. And they looked around their neighborhood, a lot of homes boarded up, a lot of crime, a lot of violence, and they said, if there's being so much success, why is our neighborhood looking this way? And they pinpointed that one of the things that was needed, in addition to being able to have development happen in the neighborhood, was that we needed it to be driven by the community residents that were in the neighborhood. So our model around development includes community organizing, community wealth building, and affordable housing development. And we've had the community organizing and the real estate component since its inception. And as we started one house at a time, when the Hope 6 program to eliminate or reduce public housing was in effect, was to be able to work with those families that were going to be displaced from 2 major public housing projects in Bowl Heights, and really support them in being able to get their own home. So we did one house at a time, and then engaged residents around being able to improve their neighborhood. And through that process, we realized that a lot of those families weren't ready to purchase a home, whether it's because they didn't have savings, they didn't have credit, or they just didn't know the process around being able to own a home. And that's how we integrated that component into our organization, to where now we do multifamily housing. We still do community organizing around community planning and land use. We have residents that don't even have an elementary school like graduation, and they're able to engage with the planning department around FAR, around zoning density, and be able to really push for the different changes that they want to see in their neighborhood. So that's a kind of transformative work that we do with our organization, and really looking at affordable housing as one of the key components, because we know that for families to have opportunities and success, housing is a stabilizing force in order for the families that we try to target, which are low-income, predominantly Latino families, first, second-generation immigrants, to be able to be successful longer term. In Bowl Heights, right now we have a dynamic that in 2006, when we called out the pressures of gentrification and displacement, everybody looked at us and said we were crazy, that it was never going to happen in the East Side. And now we have everybody talking about the gentrification and displacement that's happening in Bowl Heights. So the interesting twist that we're happening right now is that we have the folks that have traditionally not wanted affordable housing, the Not in My Backyard, the NIMBYs. But now we also have folks that are concerned about even the deeper affordability when it comes to affordable housing. So our organization maneuvers between being able to continue to build for residents to be able to stay in the neighborhood of their choice, as they have fought for the amenities that are in the neighborhood, such as the Gold Line, improved schools, parks, and all those different pieces that they really fought hard for many years to be able to have that investment come in. And now the question is, will they be able to benefit long-term from the improved amenities? So we work on multiple levels around affordable housing. And I'm going to pause there so we can get the last speaker in and be able to continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you. So now let's turn to Michael Manville. Michael's an assistant professor here in the UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, where he did his master's and PhD. And Michael, you do interesting work in housing in that you're looking at kind of broader costs of housing and densification, and maybe you could talk about that and as it relates to transportation and the like.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll echo everyone else in saying thanks for having this event and being here. I do a lot of work at the intersection of sort of transportation and land use and transportation and property markets, and so I was very happy to hear Stuart mention the sort of the transportation angle to housing affordability, and I agree completely that we should in the future years, make the most of our sort of burgeoning transit lines and our rail lines. But I think there's another dimension to that that's actually much more urgent and much more important for us to deal with, which is that we have a long history in Los Angeles and in most of the country, but particularly in Los Angeles, of trying to solve our congestion problems in the development permitting process. When developers go to build housing, the city government tells them how many parking spaces they have to have and where they have to be. It often tells developers to widen roads. It often makes them pay into different funds to ameliorate the congestion they're purported to cause. This doesn't work, right? The reason we have congestion is because we have roads that are in high demand, and they're scarce, and they're free, right? When you have a high demand, scarce, free commodity, you will run out of it. That's what happens every morning and every evening. Trying to solve that problem when someone goes for a building permit doesn't do anything for congestion. It often makes it worse, because what we do parcel by parcel, right, is we tell developers that they have to build space to store vehicles when we don't expand the street system. So there's more cars on a set amount of road every morning, right? And in addition to not solving and perhaps exacerbating the congestion problem, we make it much, much harder to build. In many parts of the city, and especially in the parts of the city where the demand is highest, parking requirements really are the binding constraint on density. That's what stops us from building housing. And it's an absolutely crucial reform for affordability to pull our transportation problems out of the housing market and deal with them where we can actually solve them, which is on the streets. And that means sort of unpleasant things no one wants to talk about, like driving gets more expensive. Like maybe we think about something like what London did, like pricing our roads, right, to actually allocate our road space. But until we do that, you always are going to have neighbors concerned about congestion, right, and coming to developments and coming to meetings and trying to stop housing developments. And you're always going to have developers trying to justify parking reductions. They shouldn't have to do that, right? The burden of proof should be on the government to tell a property owner how much parking they should have, right? I mean, that the government has no skin in the game here. The developer can understand how much parking his building needs. So I really think that, and this just goes, it's very much conforms to the idea that we need to deregulate. We need to make building a lot easier to do in LA. We have an outdated zoning code, and I think it's not often mentioned, but the most outdated part of it is essentially a suburban-style parking requirement. We build housing here like it's built in suburban Long Island. That's what our parking requirements look like. That's not going to work for a city that needs to add over 100,000 units of housing. I completely agree with Ben that even if we do deregulate, we still need also a very strong form of funding, local and protected, that would go to income subsidized housing, right? I mean, if you're making under $15,000 a year, you are not rent burdened because your rent is high. You're rent burdened because you're making $15,000 a year. And we need to protect those folks from the housing market. Ben and I have a slight difference about the linkage fee. I think that we should have a broader base that we tax to raise money for affordable housing, but I think that those two components, sort of making it much easier to build market rate housing and then finding a very strong dedicated source for income affordable housing are the things we have to do going forward.
Great. So you all have given me a nice segue to my question for the entire group. And Michael, you made the comment that when something's in high demand, scarce, and free, then you get congestion. You get people wanting to consume it. And Tom talked about coming out for a wedding and saying, oh, wait a minute, this is nice. And it's good weather, beaches, mountains, beautiful place to live. And if you're sitting in Chicago or Toledo and watching the Rose Parade, what keeps you from coming to California? The high cost of housing right now. So the question is, if we really addressed the high cost of housing and brought it down so that that Los Angeles housing was affordable in some sense that we would, let's say, all agree to, how much larger would Los Angeles be? And I'm curious as to kind of your thoughts of how many more people are going to come in, because the demand for Los Angeles housing is not just Angelenos, right? It's people like Tom who look at the weather and say, why am I not living there? So, I mean, what are your thoughts about the population growth of the city if we're actually successful, and kind of what does that do for the character of the city?
You looking at me? You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
I
I told you I was going to throw you a curveball, right?
So I just met somebody back there that does our regional housing needs assessment, so they can throw out a number for me. But I would say at the very basic level, we have so much pent-up demand for housing. So right now, the statistic I always throw out there is that we have more than 430,000 low-income Angelino families in this city alone that are in severe housing situations. They pay more than half of their income on housing, they're severely doubled up or live in substandard conditions. So that alone, right, I definitely need 480,000 new housing units that are affordable to those households. That's just one kind of way to look at it. But it's not, I think the answer to the question also isn't just what should be the size of the city, but also other surrounding cities. We're one of 88 cities in LA County, and 2 million people live in unincorporated land, and the city of LA is really stepping up to the plate to increase the capacity for housing overall, but we can't do it alone, and we need neighboring jurisdictions to also kind of join in on that fight.
Give you one example. We did a family project in Glendale, and 45 family lower income units using the tax credit program and free land from the city. And we had 4,500 applications for it. The project we did in Playa Vista, we had about 1,700 applications. That was a senior project. Family, we get that. So it's easier to get into Harvard, percentage-wise, than to get into one of these buildings. And I wanted to just clarify something I said earlier, I didn't make clear. So we had approval for this project at 178 units in West LA by the Planning Commission and the Neighborhood Council. We got to the Planning Commission, and in order to accommodate some concern over density that a few neighbors were now raising, we reduced it 155 units, got unanimous approval from the City Council. We then got a lawsuit on the California Environmental Quality Act, and we settled with them and reduced it to 124 rather than go through a 2.5-year or so lawsuit to defend the approval of the city. This is what goes on all the time with these projects, and so that's very key to change that in California, certainly to exempt it for affordable housing if you want to be successful in doing more projects and at any reasonable density.
I would add that a regional approach is definitely very important, but I would also add in not only thinking about like the size of the city, but what is, how do we shift some of the values around who our neighbors are and who we want our neighbors to be? Because I think in addition to the challenges of financing and securing entitlements, and even with the success of passing HHH and H, there is, it's unfortunate that there's one too many meetings where we hear people describe their potential neighbors, especially when we start talking about special needs and extremely low income folks, in very disturbing ways, right? And that is very problematic, and that also prevents us from being able to build quality housing for the people that are most in need. And I think I wanted to introduce this here because I know that in economics it's a hard science and we look at numbers, but it has a very real social impact and a real social issue around building housing is those folks that are like, this is great, there's a need, but I just don't want it a couple blocks from me. Right? And I think that's a really critical piece, that as much as we can start shifting in how we're talking about housing and who is going to live in that housing and how we can shift more people's and capture creative imagination around being able to really embrace and support the diversity of housing that is needed, not only in the types and not only in the physical building, but the actual people that will be living in there, is really important for us to be able to get on a very significant path to alleviate the housing crisis. Because even as conversations around the initiatives were taking place, I was driving down, in downtown LA and seeing the homelessness and the houseless. And I kept asking myself, I was like, we're going to have potentially money for this, but where are we actually going to be able to build it? And even if we update this, even when we update the zoning, and people, I know that CEQA can be very challenging and not so popular in the development realm, but that is the tool that exists to be able to curb when sometimes there's more underlying issues around why people may not want a development in their neighborhood. And I think that's a very critical issue to be able to uplift and be able to tackle across all sectors in order to be able to address the housing crisis.
Go ahead. I won't hazard a guess as to how big LA will get, but I guess what I'd say is it should be bigger, right? I think it would be good for LA, and it would be good for probably the country if LA was larger. LA is a very productive place. It's a place where people live, even despite their driving, at relatively low carbon emissions because of our temperate climate. We should have a bigger Los Angeles. But I think the more important point is that it gets bigger even if we don't build housing, right? LA is still growing. What changes isn't the size, it's the composition. People who can afford our expensive housing will move here, even if we don't build it. They'll just push out people who can't afford it, right? We'll become bigger and less diverse, right? Rather than becoming much bigger and maintaining our diversity. And it boils down to this question of, do you want to protect our built environment, the way that the city physically looks, or do you want to protect our communities? And it may be that protecting our communities means changing our built environment. And I think this, the hard work that's going to happen is, and I'm glad it's not my job, it might be yours, is that someone has to go and make the point that we use land very inefficiently, especially on the west side, right? That our future can't be one where such a large proportion of our land is just detached single-family homes. It doesn't mean we turn it into Manhattan, but we don't have an excuse for looking around Los Angeles and just saying, well, where could we put all this housing, right? We have plenty of space. We just have to have this probably fight and understand that if we want to protect our future, we have to get denser.
About in the late 70s, Zev Yaroslavsky and Marvin Browdy, two councilmen representing the West Side, put on the ballot Prop U. And I was working on a project on the beach in Venice where I wanted a mixed-use project. And two things were in the way. One, you needed a mixed-use ordinance. The city of LA, starting when it created zoning in the early 20s, did not have a mixed-use ordinance. You had to get variances, and they made you jump through so many hoops to put commercial with housing above. That is now allowed. But the change in attitude on the city that allows more flexibility in parking, density, we need that. If we talk about, I heard earlier, the future seminar on what's going to happen to all the retail in these shopping centers. That is a major source for housing and mixed use. And hallelujah that LA City now allows it, but a lot of other cities don't in this county. And it's still this very, I say primitive or Neanderthal view towards it. And we need to see these changes. I know we have the city of Long Beach here, and so there's so much you could do and any other cities represented here to make it easier to encourage a more appropriate density today. And I say we all need to support the city of LA and the planning department. I live and work in Brentwood, and our general plan hasn't been touched effectively in over 30 years. We have a 45-foot height limit. I sat in the design review board for 15 years, and they were presented a project that was 75 feet in height, and they didn't want to deal with it because only 45 feet was allowed, and it all gets down to the city has not dealt with land use. And so, who is the planning director in LA? I have to admit, I don't even know. I think, who do I think it is? The 15 council members in LA. Those are the real planning directors of this city.
Right.
And that all those issues exist in every city in the county and in this metropolitan area, and we have to all work together and support the city to update these and make these changes happen, which is a natural growth. And the answer to your question is, I don't know. None of us really know, but we know it's going to happen, and we know it's going to grow, and it's up to the Schulmans to tell us how big or what the future is, but he doesn't really know either. Anyway.
And Ben, Tom let you off the hook there, put it on the city council. But I think, I think the answer is there's a lot of pent-up demand from Angelenos alone, but also a lot of pent-up demand for those who would like to be Angelenos, which kind of comes back to a question that Michael was addresses with his research, which is it's not just about housing, but if you have significant population increases. For example, the Legislative Analyst's Office in their study of affordable housing said that if the premium for living in San Francisco, for buying a house in San Francisco that existed in the 70s were to return, the city of San Francisco would have 700,000 more people, which is a lot for the city of San Francisco. Now, I don't know about those estimates, but it brings up the issue of it's not just housing, but it's also transportation and infrastructure. And in affordable housing policy right now, it seems as if we don't kind of address that in an integrated way, or maybe we're starting to. Maybe, Ben, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right. We can't just build new housing without the additional infrastructure to support it. And I think that's why we are in a really unique time in Los Angeles, especially now that we passed Measure M, that will really help us really build out that infrastructure of our transit, and pairing that with this new transit-oriented communities program that can, it's a citywide housing policy that across the board will help increase density where it makes sense in these transit nodes in exchange for affordable housing, more affordable housing than what the density bonus requires. Layered on top of that, more incentives to nudge the private development community to build more affordable housing. So I think we are in a really unique time where we are kind of thinking about transportation and housing together and trying to build off of each other. It's not just about updating the community plans, it's also about doing these citywide housing policies in addition to that in a coordinated way. So in addition to the community plan update, we're updating the general plan, right, which is the overarching guiding document as well. So I think, I don't know, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of development reform in the city. We've done a lot in the past 3 years, and I think the unique part is we have a general consensus that we're in a crisis mode, and that we need to be throwing everything that we can at the problem. And we're building up the capacity in the planning department to make sure that when we're not just throwing things randomly up at the board, but we're doing it in a coordinated way.
So we have new taxes to pay for transportation. But what about all of the other infrastructure? We know well here at UCLA because the water main in Sunset right out here periodically breaks, or breaks with regularity. What about, do we need more taxes? Is that part of it? And if we have more taxes, what does that do to the ability to have affordable housing? Or is there some other way in which we address the infrastructure for the additional housing that the city needs to take care of its population and the growth in the population? How do we think about that?
I may not be the best person to comment on how we're, strengthening the other forms of infrastructure. We have a whole other team in the mayor's office that kind of works with our departments on that. But I think that the key point of infrastructure is the transit. That's like the part of infrastructure that is most, connected to our growing housing stock.
So you all think that that's really the choke point is transportation, moving people around, people and goods around?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important one.
Well, I would add to that, for particularly the families that we serve, there's also the aspects of education and recreation and like built environment. So I think with the question around infrastructure and the conversations that don't happen is like how do we prioritize where we're putting resources? So there is the question of additional resources, and then also like how do we prioritize the resources that we have and where they're going, and where are we spending the majority of our money, right? So the transportation is a big one because people have to get to where they need to go, whether that's walking, biking, in a car, or public transportation. And so I think right now for us, we look at the housing, we look at transportation, but we also look at environment and how environmental factors impact the well-being of people. Given in Bowl Heights and neighborhoods such as Bowl Heights where there are such incompatible uses around industry that pollutes, the way the freeways intersect our communities. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Bowl Heights, I remember doing a tour one time for some students, and one of the students was like, "Hey, why is that school built next to the freeway? Why would they do that?" And I was like, "Well, it wasn't that they built the school next to the freeway; it was that the freeways were built next to the school, right?" So I think that there is much more beyond the housing and transportation, but I think that it's an important step in being able to talk and link, because we keep, I think we're on the path to be able to look at the cross-sector impacts and how how the different sectors can work together, right? So we have like cap and trade at the statewide level that also supports affordable housing, and then for those of us doing affordable housing, like wrapping our brain around like, well, what is our role around like infrastructure and how does that impact the environmental health? So I think there's more than transportation, but right now that's a key big step in being able to bridge sectors that we've traditionally just thought of very independently.
I think that I agree with all of that. I think that transportation is also, I think, just has an outsized importance because it comes up so much in, when people want to object to housing. I mean, you don't usually sit at a planning meeting and hear someone say, if they build all this new housing, we won't have enough electricity, right? But you do hear people say the roads are going to be jammed or there's going to be no place for me to park and so forth. And again, I mean, I think the reason for that is that like we meter electricity and people pay for it when they use it, and we don't do that with our roads and we don't do that with our parking spaces. And so the conceptually simple and politically difficult solution is to change that. And because we're never going to solve the problem of transportation infrastructure by doing it piecemeal whenever someone applies for a building permit. It's just impossible.
Yeah, so that makes that the choke point.
Or one of them.
But,
It's not,
yeah.
and I agree completely. It's not the only problem,
Yeah.
but it is a big political choke point.
Yeah, but it still brings up a good point about open space and community, and that this
Absolutely.
is so much more holistic. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.